For Canada's cattle and beef industry, developments in the past 3 years have given us a vision of our future. We have normalized trade in Hong Kong, expanded access in Russia, and officially gained access to mainland China. In Vietnam, Colombia, Panama, the Philippines, Oman, we are making strides in opening markets, expanding access, and normalizing trade. In our key markets in Asia and Mexico, the investment of 2 decades of Canada Beef Export Federation representation and market development programs is speeding our export recovery. Canadian beef exports to these markets increased substantially in 2007 and 2008, held their own in the economic crisis of 2009, and are soaring in 2010, up 50% by volume and 70% by value in the first 6 months. The Federation's export members have set the goal of exporting 133,000 tons of Canadian beef to Asia and Mexico by the year 2020. We are on the road to achieving that export prosperity. In Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, and Mexico, our international directors are implementing the programs, forging the relationships, and creating the awareness and demand for sales of Canadian beef. With a projected beef import requirement of 825,000 tons by 2020, Japan continues to be one of the world's key beef import markets. Canadian beef exports in the first 6 months of 2010 increased 99% to 4,000 tons for a value of $24.8 million. Repeated changes of Japanese prime ministers and cabinets over a short period of time have caused political anxiety and stalled the resolution of various international issues, including progress in negotiations to ease Japan's under 21-month import restriction for North American beef. It now appears that Japan and the U.S. will resume working-level talks. With no progress or new initiatives for negotiations between Canada and Japan, the U.S. will likely negotiate the terms for expanded access for North American beef. In Japan's ongoing economic recession, low-priced consumer goods are thriving. Both retailers and restaurants are struggling to sell beef, with many restaurants developing lower-priced chicken menus. Competition among Japan's popular beef bowl restaurants is cutthroat, with the price of a beef bowl dropping as low as $3. At the same time, the price of import beef is soaring, making purchasing difficult. In 2009 and the first half of 2010, beef prices were up 4% from Australia and 5% from Canada and the U.S. While Australia, Mexico, and New Zealand are maintaining market share, they are struggling to increase it. Canada's market share is increasing substantially. With a limited supply of under 21-month Canadian beef, the Japan office has been taking an individual client approach to expanding Canadian sales. It's a strategy that's working. Since the market reopened in 2005, the office has gained 80 new retail and restaurant clients throughout Japan for Canadian beef. In preparation for expanded market access, the Japan office is also extensively promoting Canadian beef to consumers, linking it to the positive image Canada enjoys as a country in Japan. It participates in food shows, food fairs, and consumer-oriented events. It hosts seminars and co-hosts culinary contests for young chefs with the All Japan Cooks Association, and targets consumers in advertising and media. The Japan office is preparing the ground for the day when, with expanded access, it can approach clients on the basis of a steady and increased supply of Canadian beef to the market. Korea's beef import requirement for 2020 is projected to reach 300,000 tons. Prior to 2003, South Korea was Canada's third largest export market outside of the U.S. While Korea's economy is rebounding from the global economic crisis, the recovery is largely in the export-oriented corporate sector. consumer spending remains conservative. With unseasonable weather conditions driving up the price of agricultural products, including domestic beef, consumers are turning to import beef, resulting in a 10% drop in Korea's domestic slaughter numbers. Beef imports are expected to increase in 2010, being driven by a significant increase in imports from the U.S. With the U.S. now capturing 30% of the market share, Australia and New Zealand's monopoly is being shaken. Whether the increase in U.S. imports is being driven by consumer demand is not yet clear. The major importers in Korea contracted for significant volumes based on speculation of future market demand and are now concerned with slow sales of the U.S. product and large inventories. Still, the U.S. is expected to recover its status as the largest supplier of import beef to Korea by 2012. Consumers with a taste for high-quality grain-fed beef are becoming more accepting of the North American product, which will benefit Canadian beef when it finally enters the market. Attempts to pursue access for Canadian beef through a negotiated settlement between Canada and Korea have so far not produced results, and the issue remains before the World Trade Organization Dispute Settlement Panel. It is expected that a report from this panel would be adopted in early 2011. Throughout this process, the Korea office has continued its important role of gathering intelligence in support of the Canadian government's market access efforts and maintaining relationships with Korean government officials and other politically influential groups. Equally important for our successful return, the Korea office continues to maintain a presence for Canadian beef, demonstrating that the Canadian industry remains committed to this market. With the beef import requirement projected to reach 110,000 tons by 2020, Taiwan remains a key market for the world's beef exporting nations. In the first 6 months of 2010, Canadian beef exports increased 52% for a total of 1,900 tons or $8 million. An economic cooperation framework agreement was signed between Taiwan and mainland China on June 20th of this year. The agreement lessens the risk of Taiwan being isolated in the global market, one of its most serious challenges. The improved relations between Taiwan and mainland China are expected to see the number of visitors from mainland China increase dramatically over the next 5 years. Already, beef noodle restaurants are on the increase, as are beef imports. In 2009, beef consumption and beef imports both grew by 9%, with the majority of the demand coming from Taiwan's restaurant sector. Most of the increased imports were supplied by Australia, with New Zealand continuing to lack supply. Canadian beef is still at a disadvantage in Taiwan, with the U.S. having been granted access for under 30-month bone-in beef, offal, and value-added beef products in October 2009. The access caused protests by legislators and consumer groups, with many cities such as Taipei demanding retail stores and restaurants identify the source of their beef. With an election taking place in Taiwan nearly every year, the issues of market access are highly politicized. Despite the constraints, the Taiwan office is making headway in positioning Canadian beef as the highly visible choice for safe, high-quality, grain-fed beef. It is working with importers and distributors to implement customized promotional programs with their end customers to generate more profit and traffic into their stores and restaurants. It is targeting family restaurants and high-end restaurants. In food shows, seminars, and advertising, it is promoting the Canadian beef advantage to the trade and the consumer. In 2009, imports accounted for 93% of the total beef demand in Taiwan. The Taiwan office is working to increase Canada's share of this tremendous beef import market. In 2020, Hong Kong and mainland China's beef import requirements together are projected to be 420,000 tons. In the first 6 months of 2010, Canadian beef exports to Hong Kong, Macau increased 86% to 9,200 tons, or $37 million. China continues to be a market of tremendous opportunity. The huge and relatively young population and growing middle class are embracing Western culture and high-end consumer goods. Domestic consumption has overtaken foreign trade to become the second largest engine driving economic growth. Hot pot, barbecue, and Western-style restaurants are gaining wide acceptance, and the demand for high-quality beef is increasing daily. The official announcement July 2nd that mainland China was opening its market to under 30-month Canadian boneless beef and industrial tallow was greeted with enthusiasm not only by the Canadian industry, but by China's importers, distributors, and retail and restaurant sectors. They are now anxiously awaiting the arrival of Canadian product. There are still some steps to be taken: the negotiation of technical conditions, confirmation of export certificates, and approval of establishments eligible to export. Once actual access is realized, the China office will deliver an enhanced and comprehensive marketing plan to capture clients and market share for Canadian beef. In Hong Kong, the relatively small but wealthy population, along with the large numbers of visitors from mainland China, is keeping consumer demand high. With the December 2009 normalization of trade in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong office took advantage of Canadian access for bone-in beef to differentiate it from U.S. beef. It conducted frequent and ongoing promotional campaigns in both retail and restaurant outlets, supported by advertising, point-of-purchase materials, and product sampling. In both these markets, the China office is communicating the Canadian beef advantage at food shows and seminars, in advertising and technical materials. It is providing a solid foundation for expanding sales in these tremendous markets. With its beef import requirement expected to reach 325,000 tons by 2020, Mexico represents a market of tremendous potential. In the first 6 months of 2010, Canadian beef exports to Mexico increased 34% to 25,000 tons, or $100 million. Mexico is recovering from the economic crisis and effects of H1N1, which saw tourism come to a halt, and the occupancy rate in Mexico's resorts dropped to 8%. Total beef imports in 2009 decreased 16%, of which Canadian beef imports saw just a 2% decrease. Mexico's domestic cattle herd is also recovering, building its numbers after a series of extremely dry years which took their toll. Mexico will be in a good position to export feeder cattle to the U.S., offsetting the anticipated reduction in supply from Canada, where large numbers of cows are going to slaughter this year. On August 11th, the government of Mexico announced it would eliminate anti-dumping duties against U.S. beef and veal imports, which have been in effect for the last 10 years. The elimination will now position the U.S. to be more competitive in the Mexico market and is expected to have a direct impact on Canadian beef imports. Canada currently enjoys a 16% market share in Mexico. Achieving full access for Canadian beef in Mexico has now taken on a new urgency. Consumer demand for high-quality beef continues to grow in supermarkets, restaurants, and the many high-end resort destinations of Mexico. The Mexico office has been delivering an aggressive market development program to expand the presence of Canadian beef throughout Mexico, including seminars about the Canadian beef advantage delivered to all sectors involved with the beef industry, cooperative retail promotions with Mexico's largest supermarket chains, restaurant promotions in high-end resort regions, and food shows. It has taken the high-quality Canadian beef image to billboards and television cable networks, to the trade and to the consumer in technical materials and advertising. The strategy is working to build a steady and increasing demand for Canadian beef in Mexico. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, mainland China, and Mexico. These are the high-value markets of Canadian export success. The Federation's directors are ready to serve the Canadian industry, to help build client relationships and business networks, capitalize on market development programs,